Hello and welcome back to Bookish and welcome back to my short story project, my year-long project where I read kind of a classic American short story and discuss it one a month on my channel. This month's story was for Esme with Love and Squalor by J.D. Salinger, and this is my fourth attempt to film this video. Twice I failed because I didn't like the way the video was going, and the third time because my battery ran out, so hopefully this time we will get through it. This is oftentimes the story I list as my favorite short story, and I was a little afraid in going back and reading it this time that I would feel differently, but I don't. As a matter of fact, I like it even more, having reread it now for what has to be the 10th or 11th time, I think. And I would say that if you are not a fan of The Catcher in the Rye, as increasingly we find people don't like that novel as much as they used to, or because it was so often taught in school. If you don't like The Catcher in the Rye, let me encourage you to try some of Salinger's other work, which I think is, on the whole, better, including this excellent short story for Esme with Love and Squalor. Even the title really just always gets me, and I think, makes it kind of, in my mind, a nearly perfect short story. So, as always, I'll leave a link, if I can find one, to a PDF of the story down below so you can read it before watching the rest of this video, because there will obviously be spoilers. So one of the reasons why I've struggled, I think, to talk effectively about this story in these videos is that the story is surprisingly complex and deep, and there is a problematic element to it. So just to give you a basic plot summary, there are three sections really to the story. The first section is the shortest. Our narrator receives a wedding invitation for someone he knows in England, and he wants to go to that wedding very badly, but his wife and his mother-in-law more or less convince him that he can't go, even though he wants to go very badly. So he writes this story to send to Esme as kind of almost like a wedding present. In part because it's something he owes her, and in part, I think, because he has a desire to be there when Esme gets married, because Esme, from the story's title, is the person who's getting married, and we figure that out really quickly. The second part of the story is actually the longest, and this is when our narrator meets Esme. Our narrator meets Esme in Devon, England, in 1944. In the lead-up to D-Day. Our narrator is a soldier who's undergone some special training in Devon, England, and his training has come to an end, and he has decided to go into Devon for his last afternoon in that community. He goes to a church where he hears a children's choir perform, and Esme is one of the singers. He doesn't know her name yet, but she is. And as a matter of fact, he's the singer who he finds most striking, and he's the singer who he realizes the others follow, and she's the singer with the best voice. And he finds this choir performance uplifting. He says he almost levitates in an almost sarcastic way. He said he would if he were more religious. He leaves the church, he goes to a tea room, and he sits down to have tea and cinnamon toast, and who should come in but Esme, her governess, and her little brother. Now, Esme is a 13-year-old girl, and this is where we get to the potentially problematic part of the story, and I think it kind of depends on how you read the story as to how you think this relationship between the soldier and Esme goes. And I would tell you up front that in my mind, this is in no way a Humbert-Lolita relationship. That it bears nothing in common with that story and with Humbert being the protagonist. With the exception of, the exception is that I think that our narrator, this soldier who's gone through training in England and is getting ready for the invasion of Europe and D-Day, idealizes Esme. She is and becomes an ideal to him, an ideal of intelligence, an ideal of compassion, an ideal of good humor, an ideal of perhaps innocence and the beauty of innocence. And I do think he idealizes her, and I will say that I definitely think that on some level, when in the beginning of the story he finds out that she's getting married, that he is in fact jealous of the fact that she is getting married. So in that section, just to give you an idea of what I mean by him perhaps being jealous, he says, accordingly, I've gone ahead and jotted down a few revealing notes on the bride as I knew her almost 6 years ago. If my notes should cause the groom, who I haven't met, an uneasy moment or two, so much the better. Nobody's aiming to please here, more really to edify and to instruct. So he doesn't care if what he's writing and intends to send to Esme makes the groom uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, he thinks that's a good thing because he wants to, he sees this as a way of edifying and instructing the groom on how he should view Esme. And he believes, of course, her future husband should view Esme as he did back in 1944. So you get to decide how you view the soldier's view, our narrator's view of Esme. But the truth is that Esme also sees something in our soldier. There is a mutual thing happening there. So when Esme comes into the tea room with her governors and her little brother, the soldier and Esme make eye contact, and she comes over to the soldier's table. And she engaged in conversation, and he asked her to sit down. And when she sits down, our narrator notices something specific, or makes a specific statement about how she sat at the table. And he says, she placed her fingers flat on the table edge like someone at a seance, then almost instantly closed her hands. Her nails were bitten down to the quick. She was wearing a wristwatch, a military-looking one that looked rather like a navigator's chronograph. Its face was much too large for her slender wrist. So this is this initial description of Esme sitting down. And notice that he says she sat down and placed her fingers on the edge of the table like you would at a seance. So at a seance, generally speaking, people go to a seance to contact the spirits or to raise the spirits of loved ones who have died. And over the course of this discussion that she has with our narrator in this tea room, he learns a lot about her and she learns a lot about him. What he learns about her is that both of her parents are dead, that her mother has died during the war and her father died in combat in North Africa, and that she is now more or less the ward of her aunt, and she comes from a relatively well-to-do family, but she has in fact almost been orphaned. And for Esme's part of the conversation, her conversation is laced with descriptions of her parents. Her parents were geniuses. They were handsome. They were outgoing. They were introverts. I'm like my father. My brother Charlie, her little brother Charlie, when she comes over the table, is like my mother. And we're all these kind of exceptional, genius people. And she is, in a sense, invoking the spirit of her parents during this conversation. When she came over, she said she thought that the soldier looked sad, and that's why she came over, because she's working on being more compassionate. And he agrees that he did look sad, and he does feel lonely. And she says, you look lonely. And he says, yes, I am. And so they have this conversation. In that conversation, our soldier is sometimes awkward, sometimes he's clever, sometimes he does the right thing with Charlie, sometimes he brings up some conversation that Esme doesn't necessarily want to talk about, sometimes he expressed himself exactly right. At the end of that, in the course of that conversation, Esme asks him what he does for a living, and he says he's a professional short story writer. And it's at that point that Esme asks him to write a story about her one day. Don't forget me, write a story about me. And she wants that story to be full of squalor, because squalor is something she says she's become interested in and been thinking about and been studying on at the age of 13, thinking about the squalid. And while this seems like an odd and precocious and strange and maybe morbid thing for a 13-year-old to be thinking about, you need to remember this is a 13-year-old who's lost both her parents, a 13-year-old who lives in a country that's being bombed regularly by the British, a 13-year-old who lives in a community where American soldiers come in and out, and she's certainly seen a lot of sordid behavior, which she probably wouldn't have. And so obviously she has an interest in that. And so when she asks him to write about Squalor, he says he will. He says he would, of course, never forget her, and that he'll write her this story. Thus, the title of the story is For Esme with Love and Squalor. Because, he loves her, not in a necessarily romantic way, and he wanted to write this story about Squalor. So the third section of the story is the section about Squalor. And that Squalor is him telling a part of his war experience. So we jump forward really quickly from the end of his meeting with Esme for the first time to the war actually being over and him living in occupied Germany in a German home along with other soldiers. And he has just returned from 2 weeks in a mental hospital because he's had a nervous breakdown. I think one of my favorite parts of the story is how he introduces this section, because today I think we would refer to it as meta. What is on TV? They say he's broken through the fourth wall, where he's talking more or less directly to us, the readers. And I like this opening paragraph, this section. He says, "This is the squalid or moving part of the story, and the scene changes. The people change too. I'm still around, but from here on in, for reasons I'm not at liberty to disclose, I've disguised myself so cunningly that even the cleverest reader will fail to recognize me." So that's actually sarcastic. He hasn't disguised himself at all. He just refers to himself as Sergeant X. Sergeant X has had a nervous breakdown. Today we call that post-traumatic stress. But now he's returned to his unit. He's returned to the place where he's being housed and his things. And he is sitting in his room, essentially looking at his desk, which is covered in mail that he hasn't opened, that's just finally caught up to him. His companion during the war, who's known as Corporal Z, comes in, and in the course of their conversation, we find out several things that really, I think, are a key and important part of the story as well. We find out a lot about Sergeant X's, our narrator's, war experience, that he was at D-Day, that he fought in Germany, that he was a veteran of 5 different campaigns during the war in Europe, because we learn these things, because we know these things about Corporal Z, who's been his Jeep driver from the very beginning. We also learn that Corporal Z and Sergeant X are 2 very different people, but they were bound together by these experiences, and despite the fact that Sergeant X can be haughty and sarcastic, Corporal Z cares for him, and Sergeant X cares for and is involved in Corporal Z's life as well. So Corporal Z comes in, things happen. Corporal Z notices that Sergeant X still has a facial tremor and his hands are shaking because he still really hasn't recovered from his nervous breakdown or his bout of post-traumatic stress. And so that's how we know those things are true about Sergeant X. Corporal Z leaves after inviting Sergeant X to come down and listen to the radio. Sergeant X stays at his desk. He opens one of the letters. The first letter he opens is from his brother, who says, "Hey, now that the war's over, me and the kids would love some souvenirs. How about you send us back some German stuff with swastikas on it and some bayonets?" This depresses and makes Sergeant X's situation worse, because it reduces the war to essentially a souvenir gathering exercise. And it's clear to us now that Sergeant X has seen some really bad stuff. He puts his head down on the desk. He notices a package. He opens that package to find that there is a letter from Esme that she'd written on June the 7th, 1944, the day after he went into Normandy on D-Day, and she's written him a letter hoping that he's okay, and then sending along her father's watch as a talisman or as a good luck piece for him to keep during the war. And so he didn't have that lucky thing with him. He didn't have that, talisman, that good luck piece with him during the fighting, but he has it now. When he picks up that watch, he feels hopeful again. And the memory of Esme and Esme's kindness here are going to get him through this particular trauma. So at the end, Salinger writes, "It was a long time before X could set the note aside, let alone lift Esme's father's wristwatch out of the box. When he did finally lift it out, he saw its crystal had been broken in transit. He wondered if the watch was otherwise undamaged, but he hadn't the courage to wind it to find out. He just sat with it in his hand for another long period, then suddenly, almost ecstatically, he felt sleepy. You take a really sleepy man, Esme, and he always stands a chance of again becoming a man with all of his faculties intact." In other words, that the watch and the gift has restored him, and therefore that is the love aspect. The war aspect he describes as the squalor, and getting the watch is the love aspect and the hope. And he's writing this story for Esme as she asked, and included all of the elements. I just really love the story a lot, and I think it's great. I did just want to mention something about the story before I close, and that is the story is largely autobiographical, at least the section about Sergeant X. J.D. Salinger was a sergeant in the United States Army, the exact same rank as Sergeant X. He did go into Normandy at Utah Beach on D-Day. So he fought in the battles in and around D-Day. He fought at the Battle of the Bulge. He fought at the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. He fought in 5 total campaigns, just as Sergeant X did. Salinger helped to liberate part of the Dachau concentration camp complex, so he saw the horrors that existed there. Salinger did have a nervous breakdown, and he was hospitalized, as Sergeant X was. Salinger was a part of counterintelligence, and so when the war was over, he actually volunteered to stay in Germany as a part of the denazification process, which in a sense is what Sergeant X is doing still in Germany at the time the part of the story takes place. So there is a fair amount of autobiography, and so automatically leads to the question is, was there a real Esme, or is she just a creation of Salinger's imagination? And I don't know the answer, and I don't really want to know, because I think it makes the story even more intriguing. Anyway, I like the story, love the story. I think the writing is great. There are all kinds of clever asides and just kind of neat phrases in the story. I think it's one of the best things that Salinger ever wrote. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the story in the comments section below, if you've read it or if you're going to read it. And as always, thank you for watching.